Okay, here we are. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CSAIL Forum. My name is Daniela Rus. I'm the director of the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at MIT, and today I am delighted to host a forum with Professor Armando Solar-Lezama. Armando is a pioneer in programming languages, especially in probabilistic languages and the use of AI for programming. And Armando is also the associate director of CSAIL. So I have had the pleasure of working with him for several years now. And you are in for a treat. But before I pass it over to Armando, I would like to ask all of you to please be an engaged audience. Please start by putting your name and your location in the chat. And then please contribute at least one comment and one question throughout the talk. At the end of the talk, we will have a chance to do Q&A with Armando. And with that, Armando, please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. And thanks to all of you for joining us here on our webcast. So today I want to talk about this very fundamental question of how do we tell machines what we want them to do? This is a question that goes back to the very earliest days of computing. There is this very interesting text from Alan Turing that goes back to 1945, where he's pondering how people are going to program these new computing machines that are all the rage at this point. And he talks about how there's going to be this class of people. He thinks of them as mathematicians who have certain puzzle-solving ability, and they're the ones who are going to be telling these machines what to do. And he talks about how this process of constructing instruction tables is never really going to be boring, because anytime any part of this process becomes boring, then we're just going to automate that so that people are going to be able to go back and focus on the stuff that's not boring, on the fun and exciting and novel things. And so, this was many, many years ago, and you could say that we've done pretty well by Alan Turing's idea here, right? Today, we have these wonderful technologies that actually have people wondering, like, are we actually going to still need to learn how to program? Are programmers going to be obsolete? I think as time goes by, we're starting to see that these tools are going to play a very important role, even if they don't replace programmers. But we are seeing this explosion in the number of tools that are available to help people create programs, write code. And so programming is doing pretty well. And there's all these different ways in which we can get help in telling the machine what we want to do. But today, programming is not the only way we tell machines what to do, right? And in fact, you could say that the reason why we have all of these amazing tools is because of a revolution in machine learning that has been happening over the last decade or so, that has made it so that we can teach machines how to do things purely by examples, right? So for example, if we have, some little robot critter, we want to train it to navigate some kind of environment, we don't actually have to go and write the code that is going to tell us exactly how to move each leg one step at a time. We can use data-driven techniques to learn how to do this from scratch. And that's part of the reason why we've been able to build these amazing programming tools, because we didn't have to teach them explicitly. We're able to have them learn by example. However, there's a lot to be said for the traditional way of writing programs that these more data-driven approaches fail to capture, right? For example, generalization. When we write code, we might test it on large set of examples, but we expect it to work. on much beyond just the things that we tested it. People kind of make fun of engineers' induction, where you say, well, I tested it for n=1, and I tested it for n=2, and n=3, therefore it works for all n. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of our software generalizes really well, despite the fact that it wasn't proven to do so. Another thing that we really like about programming is modularity and encapsulation, this ability to take pieces of functionality that are very complex and hide them under simple interfaces, such that we don't need to master all the complexity of the underlying piece of code to be able to use it in different contexts. And what this also means is that different parts of the code have well-defined responsibilities. If something fails, we know roughly where in the code to look for that failure and to fix it. We can localize these behaviors to individual parts of the code. And this also means that we can develop functionality incrementally. Software gains functionality, becomes more complex over time, and we can have a certain amount of confidence that when we add some functionality, that other pieces of functionality are going to be okay. They're not going to just catastrophically forget how to do some particular functionality. And so all of these are things that we like about programming, that when we are in this fully data-driven mode, where we're just letting the data tell the system how we want it to behave, we might not get all of these features. On the other hand, deep learning, for example, has this amazing property that it's able to just turn data into functions completely automatically without the need for prior knowledge. There's this phrase that you see and you hear often in the machine learning community: let the data speak for itself. Let's not try to go in with all our biases and all our wrong ideas about how to do things. Let's just gather lots of data and let the data speak for itself. So both of these worlds have their advantages. And one of the big questions that we've been asking in the past few years is, how can we bring both of them together to get a lot of the benefits from the data-driven approach, but also get a lot of the benefits of traditional software? And it turns out that these capability to have machines write code for us, this capability of program synthesis, can actually be a really important step in that direction. So how might that look like? So in my group, we've done a lot of work precisely on this problem. How do we actually leverage the ability of machines to write code in order to attack problems that in principle are learning problems? And in principle, they are problems where you're trying to turn data into functions, but where you want to get many of the benefits of traditional software. So how might that look like? Let me give you an example. This is from a paper that was led by my former student, Kevin Ellis, who was co-advised by Josh Tenenbaum. This is a paper where it's as far from software engineering as you might imagine, right? In this case, the idea was that we want to build a tool to help linguists better understand language. And in particular, they want to be able to better understand language morphology, for example. These are the kind of rules that tell you that if you want the past tense of the word open, then you put a D at the end so that you get opened, as well as phonology rules. For example, these are the rules that tell you that when you want to get the past tense of walk, it's not just walked with a D sound at the end, but you have more of a T sound at the end, right? Walked. And it turns out there are rules in the language that tell you when you do these kind of conversions. And being able to take a language and extracting from it those rules that tell you about the mechanics of how this language works can enable lots of really interesting linguistic work. For example, if you want to study a particular dialect and study what changed between that dialect and the original source language, if you have these kind of representation, you can actually explain those differences in a very systematic way. So this is a very important capability, and the way linguists traditionally have created those rules is just by hand, right? Some linguist goes and listens to the language over the course of many months, tries to extract these rules that explain how the language works. Well, it turns out you can actually frame this as a program synthesis problem. The idea here is that what you have is this set of rules that you can think of them as a program that, given the stem of some word, it's going to give you as output the new form of the word together with its meaning, for example, knowing that it's the past tense or knowing that it's the future tense. And it turns out that all of these rules, you can think of them as a little program that is transforming these syntactic form representing these words and the sounds behind those words into these new forms. That is a program synthesis problem for which, as it turns out, the program synthesis tools that we have available to us can allow us to actually solve this problem even for real languages that people speak across the world. Now, I'm personally not a linguist. My expertise is in the area of program synthesis. So I have to trust my linguist colleagues that this is actually a description about some of the rules behind Somali and how different stems are transformed into the different forms of these words. But what's exciting is that by framing this as a program synthesis problem, we don't just learn from the data, but we're able to capture those formalisms that linguists know and understand and are familiar with, and we're able to generate this very clear, clean representations of the knowledge that we're extracting from these corpus of words. So this is an example of the kind of benefits that you can get when you treat what in principle is just a problem of learning from data as a program synthesis problem. But there's a broader class of techniques that you can bring to the table to really get this full combination between the kind of symbolic reasoning that is embodied in something like the example that I just showed, and the deep learning that makes many of these things possible. And in fact, even in tasks where your final goal is simply to learn some neural network to perform a task, bringing in some of these insights from how we create software, bringing in these insights from the programming world, can actually allow you to do some really interesting things. So let me show you a couple of examples of how these can look like. And I'm going to be focusing in particular on this problem of modularity. How do we learn models that have modular structure? And why might you actually want to do this? So I'm going to start by this work. This was led by my graduate student, Megan, co-advised in this case with my colleague and collaborator, Wojciech Matusik. So the idea here was that we were taking as the starting point this actually really cool paper that Wojciech had been working on from before of this robogrammar and being able to learn these little modular robots that are built from different parts to accomplish simple tasks. And so one of the problems that you have is, let's say that you have here this little four-legged robot, and you've learned using reinforcement learning a controller for this robot. But then you decide that for the task that you're trying to accomplish, two legs are not enough, right? You actually, four legs are not enough. You need six legs. And the problem is that this controller was specifically made for this four-legged robot, right? If you try to use it for the six-legged robot, it doesn't even type check. It doesn't even have outputs for all the legs. On the other hand, if we could break down this controller into these modular controllers that can control each of these robot segments, and then have simply this higher level control that coordinates the behavior of these two modules, then expanding to this new robot would be relatively simple. We would be able to reuse the learned controllers that we have for each of these assemblies. We would now have 3 copies instead of 2. And the only thing we would have to learn is the new coordination mechanism for these 3 set of legs, right? And the idea is that by reusing this functionality, we can train this new version of the robot with a lot less effort than what it would take to train from scratch. What's the challenge? Well, the challenge is that deep learning and deep neural networks don't really like to be told what to do. What do I mean by that? I can decide that I want each of these modules to take care of the behavior of the legs, and that this controller is going to be only doing very high-level orchestration of the motion and coordination between these two modules and the sensors. But in reality, if I don't have any control over the learning process, then there's no guarantee that that's actually what I'm going to learn. And in particular, there's going to be 2 important failure modes here. Maybe I end up with a global controller that does too much, right? Maybe these control, all it's doing is just passing the signal through that this controller had to figure out completely from scratch and not doing anything actually useful. That would be kind of a problem because the whole scheme is based on the fact that learning only the global coordination should be easier than learning the whole thing from scratch. But if these modules are not actually doing anything useful, then this is just going to be learning everything from scratch with extra steps. It's not what we want. On the other hand, we could also be in a situation where these modules are so over-specialized for this particular configuration that they're not even listening to anything that this module says. They're just each doing their thing and happens to work for this particular situation, but it doesn't generalize when we try to port it to a different geometry or even to a different task. Turns out that this second problem is a little bit easier to address by controlling how much visibility each one of these modules has to the sensors that are controlling the robot. But the real issue that we have to contend with is this first issue, right? How do we enforce a good partition so that these modules are actually forced to do something? And the idea here is that by enforcing that we want this signal to effectively be a low-dimensional signal, we force these modules to actually be taking responsibility for a lot of the complexity in the behavior of this assembly. And so one way to think about this is that there is this interface between these two modules where you have some latent space, some set of vectors that are that represent the different configurations, and then you have the action space where that actually captures the signals that are being given to each of the actuators in the robot, right? And so what you want is that this latent space, which has to be high dimensional in order to get good training efficiency, nevertheless should have the property that it only maps to a very low dimensional manifold in the action space. Because what we want is that module that is doing the mapping from this latent space to the action space to actually learn how to constrain the behavior of those legs or of those robot parts, right? So to view it a different way, suppose that you have this little robot arm with lots of segments. And so you want a mapping from this latent space to the space of each one of these actuators. You want this mapping to be such that if I move these points a little bit, I'm going to get, a slightly different position for these actuators, but it's not going to do something completely crazy, right? It's not going to just give me completely different behavior for the arm, because we want this module to actually learn how to keep the behavior within the space of reasonable behaviors for those legs. And it turns out that the way we can do that is by directly enforcing this property that small perturbations are going to have a small effect on the behavior of this robot. And it turns out that if we look at the effect that that has on learning, it's actually quite substantial. So here, for example, we see some transfer experiments where, in this case, we go from 6 legs to 12 legs. In this case, we go from 6 legs to 10 legs. We even have an experiment with a claw where we go from 4 fingers to 5 fingers. And we can see that the red line here shows the performance if you're just trying to train a controller from scratch, compared to the purple line using our approach, where you're seeing the effect of relying on these modules that have been pre-trained in this way. And so just like in software, we can take our reusable modules in a program and use them in a new context and expect them to work. We see that by doing this, we can actually train these modules in order to do a good job when they get transferred to a new situation. What is really exciting, though, to me, is that the same idea that you can use to, get some training efficiency when you're transferring from one robot to another can also help us actually understand how cells process RNA. This is really exciting, and this is a joint project with our collaborators at the biology department here at MIT. Chris Burge and Phil Sharp are the faculty members. And we started collaborating with them because they were very interested in this problem of how RNA splicing works. So basically, in every single cell in your body, you have your DNA that then gets copied into a sequence of RNA. But before that sequence of RNA goes and leaves the nucleus and it's used to produce a protein, there are these segments of the RNA sequence that are called introns that are just removed. So the RNA sequence is divided into these parts of the RNA sequence called exons that are maintained, and these parts of the sequence that are removed. And this is a process that is common to all eukaryotes, to all cells that have nuclei. And it's really important in helping cells produce the wide variety of proteins that they need in order to live. But one of the big questions in biology is exactly how does the mechanism work? The mechanism that identifies the exact points where this sequence has to be cut and where the pieces that have to be removed in order to construct a new sequence. So back in 2019, there was a big breakthrough when there was this paper published in Cell that showed that you could train a deep convolutional neural network to predict with over 90% accuracy, just given a sequence of DNA or given a sequence of RNA, all the places where this sequence was going to be spliced. And this was a pretty significant breakthrough, but it came with a little bit of a caveat, right? And the caveat is that the model is making these predictions, but we don't actually know what it is that it's looking at in making the predictions. So maybe the neural network has figured out splicing, but we have not figured out splicing, right? And you might say, well, who cares, right? If the model is really good at making these predictions, who cares that it can't explain it to us, right? We know that biology is very complicated anyway, so maybe even if it tried to explain it, we couldn't understand it. So why bother with explainability? But it turns out that in this domain, explainability is actually really important. And to understand why, we need to understand a little bit about how this process works, right? So you have this sequence of RNA, and you have these two locations where it has to be spliced, where it has to be cut. And so it turns out that there are these very distinctive motifs, these very distinctive little sequences of RNA that are identified by this molecular machinery that binds to those locations and helps cut the RNA. The problem, though, is that these sequences are a little bit distinctive, but not fully distinctive. And so, in particular, you have lots of other locations where the exact same sequences show up, but they are not actually splice sites, right? People call them cryptic splice sites. So, how does the cell know which ones are the real ones where those molecules are supposed to attach, and which ones are the fake ones that simply have to be ignored? And the answer is that there is this whole molecular machinery of other RNA binding proteins that either prevent splicing to happen at these locations or help splicing happening at other locations. And so by the interaction of all of these proteins, the cell is able to decide where to splice. And so this brings us back to the question of interpretability, right? Why do we care about interpretability? Well, the problem is that this pure deep learning model knows nothing about these proteins. It knows nothing about what's special about these different sites. It knows nothing about all the decades of painstaking work in biology to characterize all those different proteins and the regions where they bind. And having a model that explains splicing in terms of these proteins would be extremely useful because it would give us, for example, targets for therapeutics, right? It would be able to explain not just that a particular mutation is going to cause problems with splicing, but it will explain why. And in explaining why, it will open the door potentially to therapeutics to help mitigate the effects of that mutation. So we want explainability, and a pure deep learning model is not going to give it to us, right? And so this is where, once again, we go back to the whole motif of this talk and the whole idea of modularity as a tool that is very important in the context of programs and that we would like to have in the context of this deep learning model approach. So in this case, what we want is something actually very simple. We want to have, instead of just one monolithic model, we want two models. One model that takes care of motif identification, of labeling the sequence with all the different places where these RNA binding proteins are going to attach. And then a separate model that is able to predict how these different RNA binding proteins are going to interact with each other and how they're going to lead to finally giving us our splicing locations. Now, given that biologists have spent decades characterizing these RNA binding proteins, you would imagine that what we could do is just take those motifs that have already been characterized through these existing data sets and simply plug them in, treat the output of those models that tell you where different proteins are going to bind as the input to the actual learned model. So in this case, we don't really need modularity. We just need to train one model that instead of taking as input the original sequence, only takes as input this information about what binds where. It turns out, though, that if you do that, instead of getting the over 90% accuracy that the pure neural model gets you, you only get 67% accuracy. So that tells us that there's something missing here in the information about where these proteins bind, right? And after some experimentation, we found that part of the problem is that these models have a lot of room for improvement, right? And that if we can replace them by modules that are anchored by that original knowledge, but that have the ability to learn and to improve based on the data, we can improve that performance from the middle 60% to 79% accuracy. It's not quite at the level of the 90%, although we have some evidence that that 90% is partly due to the model using information that is not actually causally related to splicing. But 79% is still much better than the models that are being used before. But this raises a really important question, which is, okay, so we allowed learning to improve each one of these individual models of protein binding, but how do we know that we've actually learned something real? How do we know that our improvement in this model reflects a real biology and not simply these now learned modules figuring out how to sneak information down to this model in a way that is not really biologically feasible? Well, it turns out that that we can actually do that, and we actually have a series of experiments where we were able to show uh, that indeed these models are doing better, not just at giving us that end-to-end performance, but at predicting other kinds of experimental data about the binding properties of these molecules, right? So just to summarize, there are these big data sets for these RNA bind and seek experiments that capture a lot of information about the specific sequences that each one of these proteins binds to. And so we have this initial set of raw data from which these motifs were trained. And now the way our approach works is that it takes this as a starting point, combines them with end-to-end data about the splicing mechanism, and from that you get these adjusted motifs that then, when the output of these is passed to this aggregator that computes the interactions between these molecules, we get a prediction about those splicing locations. So one of the questions to ask is, what if we now compare these adjusted models against the original models on these initial data, the data that was used to train this initial set of models? And what we find is that there is essentially no impact on how well these models match these data relative to these. In other words, what we're seeing here is that just this data was not rich enough to fully pin down the binding behavior of these models, because what we have here is two different models that match these data equally well, and yet one of them is giving us significantly better end-to-end performance than the other. But the real test is what happens when we take data from a very different set of experiments collected with completely different experimental methodology that still aims to capture the binding behavior of these molecules. And suddenly what we see is that the models that were adjusted with the end-to-end splicing data actually perform significantly better on these particular set of experimental data compared to the original motifs, right? So this gives us stronger evidence that the improvements that we're seeing here are really due to better characterizing the binding behavior of these molecules relative to the original models that were used by the biologists. So this is an example of how, by bringing in some of these insights that started out from how do we make learning a little bit more like programming, can actually help us in identifying some of these places where uh, by learning a model that has some of these modularity properties, we can get some of these benefits of interpretability, for example, in this case, that in turn can help us gain a better understanding of a biological system. And so what we see here is really just the beginning of how we might walk towards this synergy between traditional programming and the kind of ideas and techniques that we have built up through traditional programming and that enable us to build complex programs and complex applications, and how we can apply them to these broader class of problems where our interest is not necessarily on software engineering. Our interest is on getting a robot to do a task. Our interest is in understanding these mechanisms inside each of our cells. So, going back to the very beginning of the talk, automation has really gone a very long way from where it was at the time when Alan Turing gave his quote. And yet we can see the spirit of his quote very much alive here. Lots of aspects of programming that over the years have been very, very tedious have been automated away. And we're seeing yet another iteration of this big wave of automation coming our way. And yet, the challenge of, for example, deciding what our software will do is not going to go away, right? And what we'll see is programming will evolve, but it won't be eliminated. And in fact, many of the ideas and many of the concepts that make our software engineering world work can actually find interesting and powerful uses in other domains and in other settings where the goal is very far from software engineering. And so with that, I want to open up to answer questions from the audience.
Armando, thank you so much. That was really a tour de force. So let me start by asking some broad questions. So how is the programming paradigm changing? Can you summarize for us? So we've seen a very interesting example in robotics. We saw a very interesting example in biology. How should we think about this changing paradigm of programming? If I'm in a different field, or even if I'm in computer science and I want to write a program for my class or for a software engineering task.
So that's a very good question. I think one of the things that is going to happen, and we're already seeing some of these, is we have these huge variety of tools that we can bring to bear for these programming problems. And each of these tools has different strengths. They have different weaknesses. There's going to be a lot of programming that we do today that is fairly tedious and fairly routine, and that can be pretty easily automated away with a lot of these a lot of these very powerful models that we have available to us. There's also going to be the kind of programming that is very unique and very specialized, and that looks very different from anything that anybody has done before, and where you're solving challenging programming tasks that potentially people might not even be able to solve manually themselves. And I think for those kinds of problems, programming is now going to be about how do we orchestrate these enormous amounts of computing power that we have available to us, right? How do we set things up so that the machines can actually help us um, brute force our way through the parts of the problem that are amenable to brute force, but also leveraging higher level insights about what's automatable, what's not automatable, and where we need to come in. There's also going to be, and there already is, a lot of teaching by example, right? Where a big part of it is less about how do we deal with the low level nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do, and more about how do we get all the right data, but also how do we set up the training process so that we can learn what we need to learn efficiently and without wasting enormous amounts of resources. So I think what we're going to see is many different forms of programming that are all at their core going to rely on very much the same foundational computer science skills that we rely on today, but that are going to be able to take much better advantage of vast amounts of computing power and of these very powerful models that we have available to us.
So following in this line, I wonder if we go back to the robotics example. So in the robotics example, what you have argued is that now if we understand what some of the primitives for the robot might be, then we can kind of train those primitives, and then we can compose them to create a higher level program, correct? Yeah, so and so you have shown a very interesting example for legged locomotion. But how should I think about that if I want locomotion, but my robot doesn't have legs? If my robot is a snake, or is so should we think about it according to architectural templates or according to tasks?
So that's a really good question. And I think the answer is, uh, just like in software engineering, a core aspect of software engineering is what is the right level of modularity for my task, right? And what are the right reusable abstractions that I should build my system around? I think we're going to want to start thinking about some of these learning tasks in similar ways. What are the right reusable components and reusable abstractions? I want to go back to this video that I had in the beginning that I didn't really have a chance to talk very much about. This is from a different project, but with similar goals, where what we're trying to learn in this case are actually modular environment models that allow you to train this little robot in this hybrid environment that combines, in this case, water and land, and have the system learn a model of the environment that is explicitly modular, that explicitly separates the water model from the land model without having to teach it, oh, this is water, this is land, simply by having it explore the environment. And so it turns out that in a context like this, having those modular environment models can help you very easily adapt to different environment configurations, because you don't have to learn the environment from scratch. you can actually rely on these pre-learned models very, very efficiently. So I think there's still a lot to explore and a lot to learn about exactly how we leverage this ability to learn in a modular way. What I've shown here are just some examples of how you might be able to leverage that.
So the human is the designer is still in charge of specifying the abstractions and the modules, and then the idea is for the system to take each of those abstractions and map it onto some solution that could then be generalized to slightly different geometry, but also with some limits to how much generalization there can be, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So, okay, well, everyone, please put your questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand. And let's see, we have some questions from the audience. How does this relate to neuroevolution, to the neuroevolution algorithm? So, Bhavesh Nikra is asking this question.
So there has been a lot of work over the years on using evolutionary algorithms to evolve neural networks. And in some ways, the idea there is that the evolutionary algorithm is just another optimization algorithm that has different performance characteristics the standard relative to the standard deep learning toolkit. Uh, in this case, though, what we have here is a little bit different from that in that we are uh, we are actually doing for the optimization just very standard gradient-based optimization, but we're finding other ways of introducing structure into the process. You could argue that evolutionary algorithms, for example, could play an important role given also their ability to deal with these combinations of continuous and discrete optimization, for example. But I think it's orthogonal to the idea of introducing modularity and structure into the learning process.
Okay, Daniel Wyndham is asking, as AI capabilities progress, what kinds of design decisions do you predict will be effectively deferred to AI versus will rely on human engineering collaborators, and why?
So that's a very good question. One of the things that, at least at the moment, seems to be a pretty significant difference between AI models and humans is the way in which they can take in brand new knowledge and incorporate that brand new knowledge um, into what they're doing, right? So the models right now are very, very good at the sorts of tasks that come straight from their training corpus, right? And for which they have enormous amounts of training data in their corpus. The moment you leave the bounds of the kinds of tasks that they've been trained very extensively on, now you're having to rely on in-context learning. You're having to rely on, prompting, and suddenly their ability to incorporate that new knowledge that comes from the prompt is severely diminished compared to what people can do. So in general, tasks that rely on assembling lots of different knowledge that is not publicly available and that was not present when the models were trained, I think are less likely to be easily and taken over by the models. So that's just one dimension. Right now, on the other hand, some of the things that they bring to the table is lots of knowledge about the world, right? And lots of knowledge about the um, literature, for example, in a wide variety of tasks. And I think finding ways to leverage that knowledge, deal with some of the flakiness that with which they're sometimes coming. I think this is a really important area in terms of really getting the most out of these models.
Armando, while our audience is thinking about more questions, I'm also wondering, how should we tie this into vibe coding?
So I think, again, if you're dealing with the kind of task that is very easy to check, with the kind of task that is very um, routine, that looks a lot like things that other people have done before, then you can get a very high degree of automation, and you can actually do pretty well, right? It's when you're dealing with the tasks where, for example, establishing the correctness requires more than simple test suites, for example, the kind of tasks that require uh, specialized knowledge, and especially the kind of tasks that require knowledge that is not publicly available out on the internet. That's where you really have to, and that's where the models really stop being as useful. We actually have a new survey that we just put out last month, where we discussed the broad landscape of AI tools for software engineering and identify some of the remaining gaps around some of the things that are still very much open questions in terms of really fulfilling the promise of automation that we think these tools can eventually fulfill.
Thank you, Armando. So Bob Blazer asks, the charts showing reduced training considered examples from 4 or more components to larger numbers. But to have reached 4 coordinated components, the controller must have already been well modularized. Does the same technique work in generalizing from 1 or 2 controllers to 3 or 4?
That's a very good question. So the smaller the number of controllers that you initially start with, the harder it's going to be for these to generalize, right? And I should emphasize there has been prior work around learning modular control that has achieved this by training these models on many different contexts and with many different configurations, with very large numbers of copies of these components. The more you have, the more context where you use these components, the easier it's going to be to generalize. And one of the challenges that we tackle in this particular paper is to see how far can we push in terms of starting from essentially a single example of a single robot with very small number of instances of these controllers, right? Because this is the kind of task that you're going to run into if you don't have a whole stable of robots that you've trained on, but you just finished building and training your robot and you just want to make these small adjustments to them.
Amazing. Armando, with these words of wisdom, I just want to ask you one more question. Should we still learn how to program?
Yes. In fact, one of the things you could argue is that programming is going to become significantly more useful in the future, right? In the past, one of the things we've told people as to why they should learn to program is not just the fact that, there's plenty of software engineering jobs out there, but also the fact that anytime you're interacting with a computer, right, knowing how to program gives you the possibility of automating things that you would otherwise have to do by hand. Now, in practice, that hasn't been so true all along, right? The pain of writing code and debugging it and getting it right is often such that for many things for which you could write the program, you just don't. It's too painful, it's too hard. But now, suddenly, that the barrier has lowered. Um, it that possibility becomes significantly more useful. However, programming languages are going to remain the most precise way that we have for describing computation. And so any time that we have to have precision, we're going to have a programming language somewhere in there in the middle. And whether it's written by a human or whether it's written in collaboration with a machine, that skill of being able to reason about code is going to, and to be able to think in terms of code is going to remain essential.
Okay, everyone. So let's go back to our coding lessons. What languages should we learn, or like what do you think we need to know at this point in time?
I think the specific language is a lot less essential than uh, just having a language that so well that you can think in terms of this language and where you can internalize some of those abstractions and you don't have to translate in your head between your thoughts and the programming language. In fact, one of the things that for which I think these models are probably going to get much better in the near future is actually going to be translating from one language to the other. So the notion of writing a prototype in one language and then scaling it up in another one is probably going to become much more feasible in the near future.
So I can't let this go. I'm sorry. I am having too much fun. It used to be that the early programmers learned machine language, and then we went to assembly, and then we went to what we used to call as high-level programming languages. And now we have all the AI languages. And ultimately, we want to speak with a machine in natural language. So where's so how do you see this path? How do you see the gap from being able to talk to our machines in natural language as a way of sketching the outline of the program and really getting the program? Then we can do some of that with vibe coding, but in a kind of a limited way, right?
Well, so one of the things about natural language is that it's actually very ill-suited for thinking at scale, right? Natural language is great when we're having a conversation and we want to, convey some ideas quickly between us. But, if you think about, for example, law is a pretty good example of a setting where you have to do language at scale and it really breaks down, right? Legalese is it kind of looks like English, but it's not really English, right? And it's its own different language because you have this such extreme precision that is required. And even that is pretty awful compared to the programming languages that we have. Now, one of the ways in which programming languages have gotten very good over the years is their ability to build reusable abstractions, right? And their ability to take functionality and package it up and deploy it in ways that basically mean that you only have to write things once. That is already something that makes modern programming very, very powerful. Now, one of the things that is challenging about existing programming languages and where I think the models can really help is that before we had these models, programming languages had to serve two purposes, right? They had to help you write, but they also had to help you read. And these two had very different constraints, right? When you're writing, you want something that is brief and succinct and that you can get through lots of code very, very quickly. By contrast, when you're reading, you want to have all the information there, and you don't want to have to jump around all over the place in order to understand how a piece of code works. I think with these models, we have an opportunity to break the connection between these two things, right? To write in ways that are quick and dirty and simple, and then have the model help us expand and make that thing readable and make it so that 5 years down the road, when somebody else is trying to understand what this code is doing, it's actually understandable. So I think there's a lot that the models can do for us without necessarily having to change the underlying representation that we rely on today in terms of code.
Thank you so much, Armando. We will keep this wisdom in the back of our minds. I will still aspire to be able to speak in natural language to my computer, and I want to talk with you more about that. With that, let's thank Armando and see you at the next CSAIL Forum. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.